Yeah. So yeah, we're at the end today, and just to keep in mind as well here, it's interesting as you look over the entire book of Genesis. It's got 50 whole chapters. It's a big book. A gigantic percentage of Genesis is dedicated to the story of Joseph. About this much to the creation of the universe, and this much to the story of Joseph. So that just tells you something just in comparison, that God, when he's trying to give us the fundamentals, he's more interested in people and relationship with him than he is in how to even design the universe. So just to let you know, that's an interesting thing. It's a true story. It's not just a fable or a myth. It's a true story. And through this true story, because it's so portable, it's so handy, you could go out here today and talk to someone on the sidewalk about the life of Joseph, that we've been talking about, make some comments. It's a very portable thing because the story itself, the narrative, is easy to handle. And in the early oral traditions of the life of Israel, it was easy to discuss the theology you can see in this very true story. And so here we have Joseph, who was nearly the youngest son of Jacob, the third patriarch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, we call those guys the patriarchs. Joseph, who was sold into slavery into Egypt, who went and suffered through horrible disservices, and yet God was with him and raised him up and did incredible things. And through Joseph, this son, who was willingly allowed to go through suffering and injustice, salvation came, not only to the people of Israel, but to the world. Does that ring any bells? So see, there's huge theology in the story of Joseph. And even as we close it up today, you'll see it emerge, because this isn't just a fun story. This is a story that's by design from God that unfolded so that we can understand our relationship with him. It's not just history. So here we go. You ready for the last one? Here we go. Here we go. I do so many cheap things just to wake you up. So here we go. Joseph, here's the recap from last week. I'm not going to cover the entire recap of the last 20 chapters of Genesis, but here's where we were last week in Genesis 47. Thus, Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. So there they are in the land of Goshen, generally understood to be the eastern edge of the very rich Nile Delta that's still there today. It's a real place. I'm going to say that a few times today. It's a real place. And that's where they were over there. They completely relocated, Jacob's family completely relocated from the land of promise, which is over here, over to Egypt. Now, this is by God's design. It's not an accident, okay? The land of promise, which if you turn the words around is called the promise. That's why we call it the promised land, because God promised this to them. It's not a diversion so much outside of God's will. It is actually God's will that they be in Egypt. And we'll see some more issues about that in just a second. But the eventual end, that's where God has for them, is over there. So that's where we are today, and they're making a life there. So we get to Act 1, and we start Genesis 50. This is where what I call the beloved scoundrel passes. I call Jacob the beloved scoundrel. Now, if you've read the rest of Genesis, you know that Jacob is a scoundrel. And just as an aside, God doesn't seem to wait for the best, most worthy people to execute his plan with. Praise God, because that truth still applies to us as well. He's not waiting for us to make ourselves worthy for him to use us. He uses Jacob while Jacob is still a scoundrel. In fact, Jacob's name means usurper, because he took his brother Esau's place, who was the older brother. So he's named forever in history as the guy who took someone else's place wrongly. Usurper means someone who takes someone else's place. And I'm a little bitter about this, because my name is James, and James etymologically comes from Jacob, so I'm actually an usurper. So I'm a little bitter about this. My middle name would suit me better. That's Frederick. I don't know what that means, but it's longer. Anyway, so here we go. The beloved scoundrel, who God actually came to love tremendously, and so did the scoundrel back to God, okay? So he passes today. So here we go, verse 1. So Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him, and Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. Again, another name for Jacob. Oh, but wait. We didn't talk about the death of Jacob last week, did we? Yeah, okay, so we got to go back. Here we go. So back in chapter 49, then he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered, this is Jacob talking, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. If you want to read more about this, it's in Genesis 23. But this is real. So Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, his grandfather, while he was in the land of Canaan, it was given to him by God, but they didn't actually possess it yet. He goes to this guy in the middle of the land of Canaan and buys a place in the hillside, right smack dab in the middle of the country. And actually, it's at the very highest part of the mountains in Israel, by the way. It's an interesting place. And he buys a small piece of a field that has a cave in it, saying, I need to bury my family someplace. And he buys it from this guy, and it's in the family to this very day. So Jacob's getting ready to die. Number 2. Okay, so Jacob's getting ready to pass. He says, I want to actually go in the cave where my family has been buried. So Abraham and Isaac are there. He tells us other people that are there as well right here. He says they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah, his wife. This is the first we get an understanding about where Rebekah is, actually. And there I buried Leah, who is the older sister of Rachel. Leah is the first wife of Jacob. And in the field in the cave that in it were bought from the Hittites. And so interestingly enough, he chooses, as he's getting ready to die, to say, take my bones, bury me not here in Egypt, bury me back in the land of promise, and bury me where my relatives are. Interestingly enough, his most beloved wife, Rachel, is not buried here. She's buried in, trivia time, Bethlehem. Yeah, she's buried in Bethlehem because she dies on the road as he's traveling back in the country. It's interesting that he chooses to be buried with the patriarchs rather than his wife, Rachel, the most beloved. So she's there in a tomb all by herself, lonely in Bethlehem. And to this very day, no kidding, if you visit Israel and you're on a bus going through Bethlehem, you'll nearly run over Rachel's tomb. I mean, it's right on the side of the road. It's right there. So it's a real place. Okay? So that's what that's all about. And so when Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into his bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. So pulling his feet up into his bed, that's euphemistically for dying. That's what I do when I go to bed, but I don't. I wake up the next morning, fortunately. So anyway, so he dies. So that's the death scene of Jacob right there. So let's go back to where we were today. So Joseph commands the physicians to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. And when I say embalmed, if you're thinking something like this, then you'd be right. Like a mummy embalmed? Yeah. He was mummified because he was in Egypt. And who knows how long it was going to be until he got buried back in the promised land. So, a little bit of embalming goes a long way on long trips with dead bodies in the wagon. So, yeah. So anyway, 40 days were required for this. For that's how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him for 70 days. The Egyptians wept for Joseph's father, Jacob. And if you think that's amazing, wait until you see what happens as they take the body back to Canaan. So there was a huge respect given to the father of Joseph. Joseph, the young son who was deliberately by God's plan put under suffering and injustice that he might bring salvation to the Hebrews and all the world. That's twice I've said that too, so I'll stop saying that. So anyway, 40 days it took to embalm him, but they actually wept for him for 70 days. Egypt did. And it's a nice comment in passing how they looked at Joseph as being the father of the man who brought salvation here. He had as much, if not more, honor than Joseph himself did. The father got more honor than the son in bringing salvation to the world. See, there's theology in this. So anyway, here we go. That's the mummy. That guy right there, that's Ramses II. He's the guy that built the city of Ramses we were talking about a couple weeks ago. And if he looks old here, that's because he died in his 90s. And now he's really old, but I mean, that's him. If you ever go to Egypt, that's where he lays. He's actually in a glass case, and you can get within about 6 inches of his head if you're into getting in 6 inches to a mummy. But so anyway, so that's Ramses. So yeah, so he's embalmed just like this. He's turned into a mummy, is what it is. And just one aside too, the Egyptians had a lot of spiritual goofiness in relation to mummification, and if you see the funerary roll papyruses that are buried with them, you see a whole bunch of spiritual mumbo jumbo about false gods on it. So I have to believe that when Joseph allowed them to embalm him, he probably said, embalm him, but don't do that spiritual mumbo jumbo stuff, because Jacob actually, he's a son of God Most High of Israel. So probably didn't do that. I think that's why in this particular phrase, it doesn't say that the priests embalmed him. It says that the physicians embalmed him, because it would normally be the priests. So anyway, that's just in passing. So death of Jacob, Act 2. Let me lie with my fathers. And so here's where he's actually going to be relocated. So when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, if now I found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, I'm about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now therefore let me please go up, bury my father, and then I will return. So Joseph makes his appeal to Pharaoh. Joseph is the prime minister of Egypt, but there's one in more power, that's the Pharaoh himself. So rightly so, he goes to Pharaoh and says, I want to go bury my dad. I made an oath to him. I want to go bury my dad back in our land of Canaan, the land of promise. But after I bury him, last line, I will return. Yeah, so and this would be something that would terrify Pharaoh at first, because he's come to rely on Jacob a lot for the well-good of Joseph, for the well-good of the kingdom. And this is actually the prime minister, so the guy who runs the country is going to be out of town for a good piece of time. So yeah, he's asking permission. And it's a very honorable thing. And then he assures him that I will return. He makes it actually a guarantee that he will return and what he does next. And Pharaoh answered, go up, bury your father, as he made you swear. So Pharaoh agrees to this. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up, now watch this, all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, talking about the elders of Pharaoh's household, so his most revered men, all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as the household of Joseph. It was a parade. This is huge. This is the most royal Egyptian burial you will ever see. And it's not even in Egypt, it's back in the land of promise. Crazy enough. Yeah. How far is it? I didn't look that up. You can find out for us and tell us next week. Cairo to Hebron, Israel. So, yeah, a couple 100 miles maybe. Small, yeah. One way, yeah. Here to Cedar City with about the same geography. Dry and, yeah, so. It took a few days. It's a long thing. So, and also his brothers and his father's household, so all of Joseph's brothers and the household that goes with them, which actually is implying wives right here, it turns out. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And that's how you know he's coming back. See, that's how you know. Yeah. And when they left, Pharaoh looked around, and it was a skeleton crew, really. So it's astonishing. We're talking about Jacob. We're not talking about Pharaoh. Jacob. Okay. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. That's a huge understatement right there. Like we didn't catch that in the last 4 verses. Like, what? Well, was it really big? I didn't catch that. I missed that. I was sleeping. It was a very great company. There were chariots and horsemen. Now, you got to remember, back in those times, chariots, pulled by horses, and horsemen, which actually implies just horsemen, not just the chariots, but both. Chariots were the tanks. They were the military tanks of the time. They were the impenetrable military machine of the time. And so they're there not only for protection, but for a sign of might. Because when you have such a huge cavalcade of people, I haven't used that in a long time, such a huge parade of people, then thieves on the road would watch and say, hey, I bet you they got cash. And maybe they've got food. Okay, so it's a very royal thing. So let's rob them. So you have to be protected. So they take the tanks of the time, the chariots, and they go up there. It was a very great company. And when they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, so we're up almost in Canaan, but pretty close. We're right there, right by the Jordan River. By the way, a threshing floor is what this guy's doing if you don't know threshing floors. You know, you cut your grain, your wheat or your barley off, you have the heads, and then the heads have this indigestible thing on the outside that you have to knock off, and the best way to knock that off to make it edible is to dry it, and then you chuck it up in the air, and you smack it a little bit when it's up in the air, and when you get it up in the air, the wind comes through sideways, it takes the light chaff and blows it this way, and your grain falls down. Just in case you find yourself at the apocalypse and you need to know how to do this. That's why when you see threshing floors, you always see someone throwing something up in the air. They're waiting for the wind to blow the chaff off. And by the way, you also don't do it in a piece of ground that's muddy or dirty. So the best places for a threshing floor was always an exposed piece of rock that was flat. By the way, the temple of the Israelites was built on a threshing floor, a rock, an exposed rock. And so that's another story. But anyway, here we go. So they lamented there when they got to this threshing floor, with a very great and grievous lamentation, and he made mourning for his father for 7 days. So they get close to the final destination, and they actually start the grieving. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "Whoa, this is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore, the place has been named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan." So even the inhabitants, the pagan inhabitants of Canaan looked and said, "There's a big thing going down over here." And you couldn't miss this because you've got the entire royal court of Egypt plus chariots, and it's a huge deal, mourning someone. Of course, the question in their mind is, why are they burying someone over here when it's an Egyptian person? Shouldn't they be burying him over there and then build a pyramid over him? Isn't that how they do those things? So it's a really curious kind of thing. By the way, there's a pun here. Therefore, the place shall be called Abel Mizraim. Mizraim, this word, that just means Egypt. That's Egypt in its slang term in Hebrew, so it's Egypt. The Abel part that's before it, that means the brook of, or the stream of, or the small stream of. And by the way, they're next to the Jordan, so you know they called it the brook of Egypt, the stream of Egypt. But you know, Hebrew doesn't have any vowels. There's another word for Abel. If you take the A and the E out, you just have BL. There's another word that's commonly used in Hebrew, and it has these instead, and it means mourning. Ebel means mourning. So it's a pun. It's a pun is what it is. So this could, as you look at the BL of Egypt, it's either the stream of Egypt or the mourning of Egypt. And they both work. There's puns in the Bible. So there you go. Thus the sons did for him as he had commanded them, for his sons carried him to the land of Canaan, buried him in the cave of the field at Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. And that is a real place that you can visit, okay? So they bury him there, and this is what it looks like today, as True had mentioned. You can go visit this, the Cave of the Patriarchs. It looks like this when you first approach it. They built a big wall around the cave that has buildings on top of it. If you go and expect to see a cave, you're not going to see it. But there is a cave inside that. So, yeah.
What's interesting, too, is it's separated right in the middle. Half of it's Jewish, half it's...
Half Jewish, half Islam. Yeah. Yeah, so actually the dispute going on in Israel is right there in the middle. And some of the most angry fighting between Palestinians and Jews today who are trying to settle the land in order to occupy it happens right here in this Mamre. Its modern name for Mamre is Hebron, or Hebron. And so it's one of the West Bank areas that can be tough to get to. So if you go to Israel, there's a 50-50 chance you may not be able to get there. Yeah, it's an armed camp. For years, some of the bloodiest fighting in all of Israel between Palestinians and Hebrew settlers was in Hebron.
As much Palestinian as it is
Islam, yeah. Well, because Islam, they count Abraham as the father of their nation as well, through Ishmael. So if you speak to someone who's from Islam and talk about this cave of the patriarchs, they'll tell you that Abraham is there, but they'll deny that Isaac's there. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So anyway, there we go. So that's where he gets buried. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. So they come back home just as they promised and come back to the Goshen area in that Nile Delta. And that brings us to Act 3, what I call paranoia. So when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. That's why I call Act 3 paranoia. These guys have lived under the gracious provision of Joseph as prime minister, the little brother that they did dirt to, for 17 years. And now that dad's dead, they're saying, he's going to kill us now. Maybe there's some lingering stuff here. We need to do something to make sure that one morning we don't wake up dead. So that's a biblical statement, actually. So that's a biblical statement. So they're a little paranoid about this. So they devise this plan, and here's the plan that their paranoia devises. So they sent a message to Joseph. And in the message it says, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you.
Is that a lie?
Well, let's do a vote right now. Is that a fabrication or is that a truth? Truth? Fabrication? Well, you're with the lion's share of commentators. They think it's a fabrication. The way it's written, this is what I would do if I was 13 years old and I was blaming my brother for something. I'd come up with some kind of story, and this is a pretty good story. Well, before Dad died, he said to forgive us. So it's probably a fabrication, really. So they take this note, because they don't want to face him face to face, and they send the note to the Prime Minister Joseph, trying to hopefully so that Joseph won't off with their heads because Dad's dead, and any respectful deference to his father that's been holding his hand back, he won't kill us. That's what they're thinking. So they send the note, goes over to Joseph, and at the end of that, the messenger says, and now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. See how they said that at the end? The servants of the God of your father, right? So basically, if you harm us, you're harming God's man, Jacob. You're as much at fault with God as you are with Jacob. So don't hurt us. See, this is so adolescent. I used stuff like this when I was a kid. So that's what they said. Now Joseph's, okay, what do you think Joseph's response is? Really? This would make me more mad, and then I would kill them. Really? Because it's so transparent. It's just so transparent. Okay, well, let's find out. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. He doesn't berate them. He doesn't say, what is wrong with you guys? What do you think I've been doing for you for the last 17 years? I've not only fed you and your spouses, but your children and your animals. What? I would be doing a lot of this. Wouldn't you? But he weeps. So why does he weep? What is it that causes him to weep? This is not the first time we've seen Joseph weep. He's a weeper, especially with his brothers. But so what causes you to cry in a situation like this? It just don't get it. And I think it's a lot of this. It's the whole idea my brothers still don't get it. But I think it's more than just they don't get about my character as Joseph. I think my brothers don't get it about the God we have. You just don't get, this isn't just because I'm being nice to you. This is because the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has changed me, and that's why grace has come to you. So it's not that you don't understand me, you don't get God. Don't you see, guys, that I was put in this place for your benefit? Who put me in this place? Was it me and my Dale Carnegie classes? No, it was God who did this. Why are you so distrustful of God? If God has preserved your life these 17 years, why do you think he's going to withhold his loving care from you and let me kill you? Does that make sense about our God? No. So there's a lot about this. It just breaks your heart because these guys just don't get it. And the nation of Israel, when it starts up for real, has got to get this. This is one of the big messages they need to live in their lives as testimony to the world about what this God is like. He's a God who's slow to anger, abundant in loving kindness, and go on and on and on. Somehow in our lives we need to demonstrate who this God is. And Joseph has been doing that, and they missed it. And it grieves him. His brothers also came. See, they finally do the face-to-face. His brothers also came, fell down before him, and said, behold, we are your servants. That is, we're yours. You're in charge. You're the boss. Whatever you want to do, we're good for that. And Joseph said to them, don't fear. Am I in the place of God? Am I the one that brings judgment and condemnation? Now, I got some pretty fancy duds. I'm Prime Minister of Egypt. But am I in the place of God? That's why I would love to make a movie, because you can see him with this, with this gold hat and his mascara and, or whatever it is they put in their eyes. And he's up there. He's looked pretty darn impressive, right? And he's standing up there looking pretty darn impressive saying, am I in the place of God? And I'm sure one of them probably looked up and says, well, it sure looks like it. But he's saying, listen, I'm not your judge. I'm not your judge. I'm not here to condemn you. That's not what this is all about. Because the most famous verse in probably all of Genesis comes at the end in verse 20. As for you, you meant evil against me. No question. Everyone agrees to that. But God meant it for good. Really, the most famous verse in Genesis. And it rivals probably the most famous in the entire Old Testament. So here, remember we said he's grieving because of the fact they don't understand who God is? There it is. There it is. You guys just don't get it. God is so big and so sovereign, more sovereign than the Prime Minister of Egypt. He is so sovereign that he can take your stupidity and your judgmentalism and your condemnation and your pettiness and all those things that drove you to get rid of me because you're jealousy about how Dad treats me. God can take even all of that, and he stays in control of the situation. And he uses that situation to bring good. So yeah, you intended this for evil, and it was evil, but God's bigger than your ability to do evil. How about that? And not only that, but he's bringing good back to you, the ones who are planning evil. Now, we could stop here and talk theology for days on this, because it was while we were yet sinners that Christ died for us. And it was while Joseph's brothers were planning evil that God said, I'm planning good for you. How can that be? How can that be? Why isn't a judgmental God not up there making a list and going, these guys are toast? And when Jacob is gone, we're going to get rid of him, and Joseph's going to take him out. It's going to be glorious because these guys did evil to the one that He doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. He's actually in the midst of all this bad, he's planning good for the ones who are doing the bad. And God does that with us. I mean, this is part of the story that keeps getting told back and back. Can you actually believe the fact that God in his loving kindness for us can reverse acts of evil that we intend on others to bring benefit to us? That is just astonishing. I'm getting goosebumps. You getting goosebumps? Well, on this arm I am. Yeah. That's an amazing truth. That's really an amazing truth. And Joseph, instead of berating his brothers, says, I'm not in the place of God, and you don't get it. God has been bigger than your evil for your good. For your good. Now, it raises another interesting question about predestination and free will. Can we choose to do evil to such a degree that God can't compensate by bringing good? Well, no, actually. He's in that much more control. Well, then I don't have free will. Well, yeah, you do. But God is so sovereign in the universe that even your free will cannot derail his plans of good for you. We should stop there and just have lunch. Because that's one of the best pieces of good news in the entire Bible. And it extends to when the Messiah, the promised Messiah, finally comes in Jesus, and even while we were yet sinning, he died for us, and he brings good to us while we're actually speaking evil. I don't know. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. That's just great. It's just amazing. By the way, in the New Testament, we call that grace. Just to let you know. Okay. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So he's saying it's not just you. God did save you and your families, but God was doing this for not just you, because it's not just about you. It's about everyone who is in danger because of the famine. God's got a view to everyone, not just the people of promise. that go back to the promised land, because the Egyptians benefited from this. So that's good news. I'm sure that when Paul started roaming around the Mediterranean world, and as the he's the uber Jew, he's the Pharisee Jew, he's highly educated, he could come and say to them very, very authoritatively, he could say, don't you know that in the Old Testament, God brought good to Gentiles as well as the people of promise? He's bringing good to you today through Jesus. And he could say that. And they could say, well, what do you mean? And he could quote this story. That's why these stories have such great theological power. They can express things about the nature of God that are unchanging and upon which we can place our trust right now. Okay. We need to move on. So, don't fear. I'll provide for you and your little ones. I'm going to do what I've always done. Again, somewhat like God, who never changes, who's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Joseph is saying, I'm the same yesterday, today, and forever. I cared for your families before. I'll continue to do that. He's actually acting. Although he says, I'm not in the place of God, he's acting with the attributes of God because God's with him. Oh, there's theology dripping all over this. Thus, he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. I like this too, this little thing that spoke kindly to them. That sounds like it's repetitive for this comforted part. Spoke kindly literally in Hebrew is spoke to their heart. This says a lot to me because when people are deeply disturbed, and many times, in this particular case, they're afraid that Joseph's going to kill them. They're afraid that bad's going to come. What he does, instead of just trying to convince them of his commitment to their families and to their children, he actually speaks to their heart. He gets the issue that's deep inside, that's driving this silly, fabricated note and this feigning obedience of falling down, and he speaks to their heart and he reassures them. No. There's theology in that as well, yeah.
So his brothers really didn't know until the end that they were forgiven.
They didn't understand forgiveness until right here. Right here. And forgiveness is not just a temporary one-time thing, like I'll look over that. That's the wrong word. I'll look past that now, but later on we'll come back to this. He's saying, no, we'll never come back to this. Forgiveness says, it's done. I'll provide for your families. It's done. And that's how God does things. This theology through all of this stuff. He spoke to their heart. And that brings us to Act 4, 54 years later. So here we go, 54 years later. I should have a clock here. 22, verse 22. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. By the way, I told you about that numeric sequence in the ages of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It doesn't work for Joseph, but it does. So if you're prone to do funny number things, you go look at it and see if you can figure it out. And I'll put you out of your misery next week. It's very interesting. So anyway, Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. That's his son, Ephraim. And the children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, his other son, were counted as Joseph's own. So he lived a really ripe age. By the way, Machir here is distinguished because if you're a Hebrew speaker, you'll realize there's a great irony here. The children also of Machir, this is his grandson, the son of Manasseh. Machir in Hebrew means one who is sold. Just like Joseph was. So I think that grandson Machir was actually named after Joseph, but instead of calling him Joseph, they called him the one who sold. Great. There's just great warmth in this entire thing. Exactly. I'm about to die. This is Joseph speaking now. It's 54 years after the death of Jacob. I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the land of promise. And this is a wonderful way to put it. He will visit you. Now, I don't know what the version of the Bible you use. They have different translations for this, but this is the literal translation. In Hebrew, it means to visit you. And it comes from the idea that if you find yourself sick one morning and you're bedridden and you're doing very poorly, and people start missing you, in the village and say, "Hey, where's Jim?" Well, he's off in his tent, puking or something. He's just not feeling really good today. And so you know what you do to go comfort him? You go look in on him, and you see how he's doing. And that's exactly what this phrase means. Don't worry. God will look in on you to look after your good. Because very soon, within a couple 100 years, things are going to turn south for them. And it's not going to be the pleasant Disneyland experience of Goshen. It's going to be something quite different from that. So they will wonder, will God ever get us out of this? And Joseph's words will come to their mind. Remember, as he was dying, he said, God will look in on us. That's what we're praying for. We're looking for him to look in on us. By the way, in our fallen state in this Egypt, God looked in on us by becoming a man and looking in on us and bringing good news of health and salvation. There's theology in this. He visits us. Okay, then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So the same request as his dad did, say, I don't want to be buried here, but I'm going to live here until I die. I'm the prime minister. I got work to do, But when I do die, take my bones out of here. Now, he's not very specific about where his bones are supposed to go. So, the presumption is it'll be just like Jacob. You leave there and you go into the cave of Machpelah, which is in present-day Hebron, and I'll be buried with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But I took a little detour right here. I wondered, is that where he went? Because Joseph isn't being specific right here. He's just saying, get my bones out of here. Where do they go? Well, if you read on through Exodus, you find that Moses picks up the bone in Exodus 13. So, as Moses, let my people go, as they're getting ready to leave the land, they say, hey, we need to find Joseph's bones because they got to go back. Now, this is 4 centuries later. 4 centuries. They find his bones, pick them up, put them in their pockets or whatever they're carrying them in, and by 400 years, it's just bones. So, yeah, that's true. So he picks up the bones. By the way, interesting trivia. Do we have time for this? No, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Did you know that the box that you put bones in Hebrew is the same word that's translated ark for the Ark of the Covenant? That box that carries. So as they went on their exodus through the wilderness and stuff like that, they were carrying 2 boxes. 2 arks. One box had the 10 Commandments in it, the law of God, and the other one had the bones of the man who seemed to live it wonderfully. There's theology in this about the fact that somehow that statement of righteousness needs to be incorporated into our lives. And God is the one who made it happen in Joseph's life, and that's what he's doing in our lives. Woo! Okay, so anyway, he picks up the bones in Exodus 13. You go all the way through Exodus, and they don't drop the bones in the promised land. You know why? Because in Exodus, they never make it to the promised land. But since we know it's Moses that picked them up, he didn't take this route because Moses' route over to the promised land looked a lot more like something like that. So that's what he did. And it took a long time. It took 4 decades to get there. And even at that, they don't make it totally the promised land. So we're hoping that his bones get deposited somewhere after that. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Joshua. Joshua is the narrative of them getting into the land. I hope they do in Joshua. You start reading through Joshua. Bones aren't going down, bones aren't going down, bones aren't going down, bones aren't going down. You get to the last chapter, the last handful of verses. Bones went down. Thank you. They go down. You can find it in Joshua 24, but they don't go there to Machpelah. They go up there. That place, Shechem. Remember that little piece of land that Jacob said to Joseph? I'm going to give you this little piece of land, a little chunk, up there. That's where the present-day Jacob's well is. That's right at the end of the Nablus Valley up in the West Bank. It's Nablus. So that's where it is. It's up in Shechem. So that's where they put his bones. I'm going to take a detour just for a second before we close this out because we're 1 verse from the end of Genesis. So we got a little bit of time for the detour. And this detour is an ex-Mormon moment. So don't get too defensive here, but it's important for those of you who've come out of the Mormon church to understand something at this point. Joseph Smith added a bunch of verses to Genesis right here. A lot of verses. And so what we're going to do is an experiment. Those of you who were with us previous part of the year looking at textual criticism, you use the well-developed techniques of textual criticism to weigh a text and find out whether it's authentic or not. So we're going to do that very quickly, and we're going to check Joseph Smith's inclusion in Genesis. Here's the size of it. The Joseph Smith translation is Joseph Smith's fixing of the Bible, and here's the 3 verses at the end of Genesis. I just copied them on a piece of paper, but if you go to Joseph Smith version, it's this big. So that's how much he added. A lot of LDS don't know this. It's not made too well known because, well, There's some problems with it. So that we're going to use our textual criticism and check it out. One of the first things you do in textual criticism to see if is this authentic Moses-authored text. It should be consistent with the 50 chapters of literary evidence we have that came before it. In what ways? Vocabulary ought to be very similar. Doesn't have to be a carbon copy, but it should be very similar. You really shouldn't come and suddenly find vocabulary that's never existed yet in Genesis. But you do. How badly? Well, words and phrases that never existed in Genesis suddenly show up in Joseph Smith's edition. Words like seer show up 6 times in these 2 pages. Nowhere else in Genesis. Words like, or phrases like latter day, 4 times in these 2 pages. Nowhere else in Genesis. It's as though the author, if it was Moses, decided to suddenly shift his vocabulary, because there are places where he would have used these words in other contexts. Let me show you the most egregious one. Oh, no, that's not, it's next, sorry. Messiah is in here twice, which is a concept that's the word itself is just not used much in the Old Testament at all, and it's never in Genesis. Here's the egregious one. This phrase, fruit of my loins or fruit of thy loins, shows up 12 times in these 2 pages. Fruit of thy loins, fruit of my loins. I wondered about this. I wondered if in the books of Moses, 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, does Moses use them in those? No. Is it used anywhere else in the Old Testament? No. Is it used in the New Testament? Once. When Peter does his address at Pentecost, he uses the phrase, fruit of thy loins. But somehow Moses adopted this phrase 12 times in the 2 pages that we lost and Joseph Smith restored. From textual criticism perspective, all the alarm bells ought to be going off at this point, because this is very inconsistent with what we've known as the vocabulary of Moses up to this point in Genesis. And then it also introduces some biblical conflicts. And I'm just going to show 2 here. One of them, it claims that Moses is of the tribe of Joseph. And if you don't know much Bible background, you know that Moses' brother is Aaron, and Aaron does all the priesthood stuff. Priests can only come from the tribe of Levi. So if Aaron and Moses are brothers, they're both from Levi. They're not from Joseph. But it claims here that he is. By the way, if you check the other passages in the Old Testament to see whether or not Joseph Smith fixed those to say that Moses came out of Joseph, he seemed to have missed those. So the conflict remains. And also just one more thing before we get back to the passage. He says this at the end. This is a quote from the Joseph Smith translation. Verse 38. Our version stops at 26. And he was kept from burial, talking about Joseph. He was kept from burial by the children of Israel, that he might be carried up and laid in the sepulchre with his father. Why are you shaking your heads? Because we just read this passage in the last heartbeat, and he's not there. In Joshua, it says he's up in Shechem. He's not in Machpelah with Jacob. But maybe Joseph Smith fixed the other passages, like Joshua, that says he's actually buried in Shechem. Maybe he changed it over to Machpelah in Hebron. I missed that one. And he also missed the part, well, anyway, he didn't fix that. So what he did is he introduced conflicts with the existing Bible that he didn't fix other places. So he leaves us with this problem. So as textual critics, we look and we say, well, he introduces a lot of foreign language that doesn't exist anywhere else in Genesis. He comes up with conflicts with the other Bible passages that he doesn't also fix there. We tend to think that maybe this is bogus. Now, I'm not just saying that because that's my opinion. It's just from textual criticism. It just really looks that way. And to put the nail in the coffin, in a sense, when you come and read the content of Joseph Smith's edition of Genesis, he writes it so that he can introduce prophetically himself to the reader of the Old Testament. Motive. So anyway, we don't want to be bashing, but I want you to be able to engage your analytical thinking. And you guys just did that when I said he was buried with his father in the sepulchre of his father. And you went, no, because you read the Bible. And so that's really all we have to do, is to weigh these things, read the Bible and see what it says. So anyway, let's get back to our passage and we'll close out Genesis today. Laid in the sepulchre with his father, that's pretty specific language. So no, it's not down here, it's up there. And Never mind. Okay, so let's finish. Last verse of Genesis. So Joseph died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him just like they did his dad, and he was put in an ark in Egypt. And that's the end of Genesis. By the way, I've talked about this before, maybe we'll show it again, this movie we saw earlier this year called Patterns of Evidence. They found some interesting grave sites in the Goshen area in Avaris, that town that I talked about. And in that area, they found a very curious set of tombs, 12 of them in number, very distinctive. One of them more distinctive than the others. And the problem with that most distinctive one is someone grave robbed it. And they took the bones, which nobody does, because you can't sell them. The bones in the most prominent of the 12 graves that are really very non-Egyptian are gone. So could that be the bones of Joseph? We don't know. We don't have proof of that, but that's very interesting. They embalmed him and put in coffin. Okay, so let's bring this to an end, the end of the life of Joseph. Again, this very famous phrase, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. There is an extraordinary message in the life of Joseph about this idea that we call providence. And providence is the acts of God in the lives of those whom he loves and are called according to his purpose, Romans 8:28, who guarantees that everything works together for good. Now, the interesting thing is in providence, the God of hand in those events, providence is almost impossible to see in the here and now. In fact, the acts that happen to you right in the here and now often are inexplicable. They don't seem to make sense if I think about what God's trying to do for my good. And you can tell when that's happening because you usually go back to God and say, God, what are you doing? Let me tell you what would be good for me. And God says, you don't have a clue what's going on. They seem inexplicable. The only time you usually see them is in hindsight. And that's how we see it in the book here. You go past those things, you turn around and look back at the timeline of your life, and you go, it's lucky that happened, and it's lucky that happened, and wow, I'm fortunate that happened. And then you suddenly realize, wait, this looks like a deliberate plan that happened here. And yet at the time it's going on, I don't see God's hand in it. But when I look back, it's not a matter of me just making this up. I see it. I see the coordinated hand of God in what he does. And now here we are at the end of Joseph's life, and that's exactly what Joseph is telling them in this phrase. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. He was in control even when you were sinning your heads off, even when you were hating me to death. God was still in control. And the good news, as we come back to Romans 8:28, is that for those who love God and are called according to his purpose, he makes sure that everything works together for your good. Okay, so I have a question. I went through this really bad thing last year. And that's a valid question to ask. And it's happened to me as well. And while I'm in the midst of that bad thing, I don't in an impertinent way say, okay, God, you need to explain yourself right now because this is just painful and I don't want to go through this anymore. Let's make this stop, okay? And many times, I'm getting personal, sorry. If the application is too close to home, you can just kind of listen to this later. But that's what we do because we know that God loves us and we know that he's sovereign enough to overrule the bad things, but we're too impatient for him to actually work out the plan and make it happen. And the worst part, the best part of the story is that God works for good in your life by using things that may be painful. Good news, bad news. Good news is God's in it for your best. Bad news is it might hurt. Now, if you have children, or you are a child of someone's, which, okay, that's everybody here. I was thinking about someone for a second. Yeah, they've got parents. So, but if you know about children and about parents, you know this is true. You know this. God made us parents or gave us parents, so we understand that sometimes we are not the best authorities on what's good for us. Think 13-year-old boys and girls. We're not the best authority on that. And so as parents, you often overrule, and it's painful for them as you overrule. And then you say something like this. It's for your own good, and someday you'll thank me for this.
I've heard that and said that.
You know what? And that doesn't help at all in the moment. It doesn't help at all. But I turn around and I look back on my history, and I say, hey, you know what? They were right. They were right. And that's what this is all about. The providence of God is his love extended for you that cannot be thwarted. But it doesn't mean it's always going to be comfortable, and it doesn't always mean it's going to be painless. But on the backside of it, when you come out of it, you'll say, oh, that was gold. I'm glad God did this. Other passages where it says that God's like a good father. He disciplines the one he loves. Why? Because he enjoys watching you in pain? No, because he wants you to come out on the other side for the better, not for the worse. And again, we have so many analogs in parenting. We just know this is true. So when you find yourself in one of those things where you feel like God's saying, you're going to thank me for this someday, then in the midst of that pain, you need to thank him right now. That's why it's an amazing phrase when it says that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Basically, while we were still shaking our fist at the sovereign God and saying, you don't love me because of what I'm going through, that's evidence. And he's saying, doesn't make any difference. I've got a plan for your good. Oh, we need to quit. See, you got theology things happening in your head right now. So let's put this off. We can talk about this more offline here because we're running out of time. In fact, we're way out of time. But as we leave Joseph, I want you to leave understanding that there's theology embedded in this story that is so deep and so revealing about the nature of God. Don't just reduce this story to a story. Look at the big picture, because God designed Joseph's experiences to demonstrate to us the God who is near, and the God who called us to himself, and the God who died on our behalf, and the God who sent his Son to suffer injustice that we might find salvation while we were yet sinning. And that's the story of Joseph. Next week, I'm going to start a series that's going to be really different for me. The byline of it is How I Escaped Organized Religion and Found Jesus. So maybe we'll talk about that next week. So let's pray. Father, your great and encompassing love to us continues to stagger our mind. And your ability, the ability of your love to make your grace to us sovereign, to always win for our benefit. We can't have a hard time trying to figure out how that works, but I know that it works. And we see it in the life of Joseph. We see it in our own lives as we look back in hindsight for where you've brought us from. We see your hand, and somehow through all of this we've come to know who you are, and we've come to fall in love with this God who comes near to us, who looks in on us, who visits us for our benefit. We just love you so tremendously, so very much. And we pray that, just like in the life of Joseph, that you would continue in your loving kindness and the sovereignty of your grace to take us in those places of our best, which we know brings us closer to you, because you are our best. And Lord, forgive us when in our impatience we shake our fist at you and demand a response for what we're going through. Lord, we're just weak people, and we want to understand your love for us, and we in our small minds can't understand how this experience connects to that. But we do know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that for those who love you and are called according to your purpose, your love always wins. And that gives us hope. So thanks. Amen.